Chuck Norris, seeking solitude in nature, suddenly hears a cry for help and rushes to rescue a young farm girl in distress. He finds three thugs attempting to assault her and, without hesitation, stops their brutality with precise gunfire. The girl reveals that these criminals work for a powerful mafia boss who controls the entire town through fear. Realizing they are both now targets, Chuck takes responsibility for the girl's safety and attempts to flee with her. The mafia boss puts a massive $1 million bounty on Chuck's head, sparing no resources to hunt him down. Along the way, they face crooked cops and armed thugs at every turn, desperately searching for any safe haven. Yet Chuck has a plan that might change the balance of power, despite the steep risk of failure. No one knows how the showdown will end, but one thing is certain: the city's fate hangs by a thread. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories created just for you. Warmth settled over the countryside like a comforting blanket as the last rays of sun lingered in a dusky sky. A single figure on a gleaming motorcycle cut across a field that glowed gold with ripening wheat. The engine's hum wove into the subdued chorus of an early summer evening, where crickets had begun their nightly serenade and a gentle wind teased the tall stalks of grain. The rider, Chuck Norris, rode with a composure born from years of navigating roads both literal and metaphorical. His presence on the back of that powerful machine held a quiet self-assurance, no dramatic flourish, merely a steady grace that matched the calm of the descending night. He felt the breeze rush against his face and welcomed the comforting fragrance of an open field in its prime season. He was not a man prone to outward displays of joy or worry, but beneath his disciplined exterior, he embraced this ride as if it were a long-deserved gift. The day had been hot, the kind of scorching heat that singed skin and baked earth. Yet now, in these fleeting twilight moments, the air turned mild and almost sweet. He could sense the earth breathing around him, exhaling the memory of a sun-soaked afternoon. This was the solitude he had sought, a ride across an endless stretch of farmland, with no urgency but his own, no obligation to do more than simply exist in harmony with the land. He guided the bike along a dirt path at the edge of the wheat field, noticing how the tall stems bent in the breeze, catching the last of the sunlight like a mirror to the sky. Thoughts traveled at their own pace through his mind, echoes of past challenges and victories, recollections of nights spent in places where peace was as elusive as water in a desert. There was a certain fascination in the simplicity of a rural evening, free from the demands of crowds or city lights. For a time, he almost forgot the pressures that came with a public image and a life in front of cameras. In that field, there was only dust on his boots, the throaty rumble of his bike, and the peaceful hush that spread over the farmland. He found a spot near an old oak tree whose branches hung low as though in welcome. The ride had delivered him to this quiet corner of the countryside, and the impulse to stop arose from somewhere deep within, an instinct telling him this was where he should pause. He cut the engine, letting the silence roll in, so profound it seemed to magnify every small noise, a distant bird calling out one last note before settling in for the night, the gentle rustle of leaves overhead, and the hiss of cooling metal from the bike's engine. If tranquility had a sound, it would have been this soothing hush. He swung a leg off the motorcycle, letting the machine rest on its stand, and felt the soil underfoot, soft from recent irrigation. A few minutes of utter stillness passed in which he simply absorbed the environment. Summer blossomed in every direction, carrying scents of cut hay and wildflowers, melding with the fragrance of ripening wheat. The sky overhead was a canvas in transition, blue giving way to lavender and pink, a delicate show that heralded the approach of nightfall. He closed his eyes to savor it fully, taking in a measured breath. Moments like these had become rare treasures, and he accepted the gift of silence that nature offered. It was exactly what he had wanted, a chance to anchor himself in something grounded and timeless. Then, that precious quiet fractured with a sound so shrill it jolted him from his reverie. A cry tore through the stillness, unmistakably human and laced with terror. It was a woman's voice, clear enough to pierce the hush of the farmland. That single plea for help obliterated the gentle lull of dusk. Before his conscious mind could piece the situation together, he found his body already in motion, adrenaline surging through veins that had grown used to responding to danger. He sprinted toward the direction of the scream, heedless of the bike behind him, determined only to reach the source of that desperate call. He crossed the edge of the field and vaulted over a short fence that bordered a ranch property. Weathered fencing and a scattering of tool sheds indicated this land had been worked by hand, likely for generations. Weeds along the path brushed against his legs, but he paid them no heed. Anxiety pooled in his chest, though outwardly he wore his familiar composure. He drew nearer to the ranch buildings, eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. A small cluster of rundown structures came into view. The largest, presumably the main house, had a porch with a sagging roof, while a modest barn with peeling paint stood off to the side. His eyes caught a glimpse of disturbed gravel and fresh footprints, signs of an earlier scuffle. And then he saw them, 3 men who had cornered a younger woman near the barn door. She wore dusty jeans and a work shirt, her boots caked with dirt, likely a farmer's daughter, someone whose life was entwined with the land. She tried to push them away, but they had overpowered her, tearing at her clothes with intentions that radiated cruelty. His mind registered the scene with cold clarity, 3 men, possibly armed, though he saw no immediate sign of firearms. Their posture spoke of men who rarely feared consequences, who saw violence as routine. They had pinned her to a wooden rail, ignoring her screams and pleas. Rage stirred in him, not a loud, explosive anger, but a deep and focused indignation at the affront to human dignity. He moved swiftly, instincts guiding each step. Though advanced in years compared to men half his age, he had never allowed that to sap his strength or skill. He approached with calculated speed, drawing from a lifetime of combat experience that had trained him to measure distance and advantage. He reached for the Colt 1911 at his hip, a trusted companion he carried for emergencies. This was precisely such a moment, an assault that required immediate intervention. He closed in, noticing one of the assailants tilt his head in alarm. At the sight of a stranger, the man barked something to his cohorts, who turned around, halting their assault. The young woman collapsed to the ground, her arms trembling as she clutched what remained of her shirt. Her eyes were wide with both relief and continued terror. He lifted the Colt, his gaze unwavering as he aimed. He kept the firearm level, in a posture that suggested absolute control. Wordless condemnation filled the space where language had no power to express the gravity of the violation unfolding. Though he seldom spoke of it, he carried within him a moral code that allowed no compromise when it came to abuses of power or the suffering of innocence. The men taunted him, stepping away from the girl and advancing toward him. They scoffed at his age and the solitary nature of his intervention, as though convinced he lacked the will or ability to enforce his threat. To them, he was just another meddler who could be silenced with a few punches. Yet their bravado clashed against the unspoken warning in his stance. Without waiting for them to learn their error through reason, he squeezed the trigger. The controlled sequence of shots reverberated against the wooden walls of the barn. Each bullet found its mark with chilling precision, 3 men, 3 wounded legs. The men collapsed in agonized confusion, howling into the night air. Their moans of pain filled the silence that only a moment before had been punctuated by the terrified screams of the rancher's daughter. He glanced at the men as they writhed on the ground, eyes cold as steel. He believed in giving chances, but these men had already squandered any claim to mercy. The pain in their expressions confirmed how thoroughly they had underestimated the quiet figure who had arrived on a motorcycle. A few battered words of derision escaped his lips, making it clear he had spared their lives but had no sympathy left to offer them. Then he turned his back on them, focusing on the trembling young woman. He approached her with measured steps, eyes softened by concern. She was in shock, her breathing ragged. Though he spoke no comforting phrase, his presence exuded calm. She allowed him to guide her to the house, her steps faltering from the trauma. Her shirt hung in tatters, revealing bruises on her arms, and he quietly placed a hand over her shoulder, hoping to convey that she was safe now. The old wooden porch creaked beneath their feet as he led her inside, mindful of each step so as not to jar her further. The interior of the ranch house was sparse but serviceable: wooden furniture, a modest kitchen, walls adorned with practical items rather than decoration. He found a dusty chair and helped her sit, then took a moment to ensure the door was firmly shut behind them. From the window, he could see the silhouettes of the three men still sprawled on the ground, though at this distance, their moans were barely audible. He looked away, returning his attention to the woman who seemed to be on the verge of tears, her body shaking in the aftermath. She described who they were: foot soldiers for a powerful mafia boss who controlled not just this ranch but the entire nearby town. She spoke in broken phrases, describing how the local police were in the pay of that criminal empire, how this small community was strangled by corruption. Her voice, though trembling, carried a fatalistic tone. She had little faith in a justice system thoroughly compromised by the very men who had nearly assaulted her. Hearing this, he recognized that the violence he had just prevented would not be the end of the conflict. His intervention stood out like a beacon that could not be ignored by those who thrived on intimidation. He understood that he had set off a chain reaction. By injuring the hired thugs, he had signaled a new threat to the boss's authority. Men like the three outside were not likely to abandon retaliation; they would report back, nursing their injuries and fueling their leader's wrath. The old patterns of intimidation would soon converge upon this small ranch, fueled by a vindictive desire to show that no one defied the local mafia. She mentioned this with a trembling voice. The boss was known for swift and brutal punishments against anyone who disrupted his hold over the region. Night settled further over the ranch, ushered in by the low hum of a distant wind. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, a weariness born of both physical trauma and a deeper emotional strain. For a moment, he let himself feel the quiet rage that boiled inside. No place should be subject to such fear, and no one should feel helpless in the face of that kind of cruelty. He silently vowed to shield her from whatever storm approached. Honor dictated that he could not simply walk away from this, not after what he had witnessed. They spent the night under tense vigilance, alert for any vehicle lights or footsteps that might signal an attack. In the small living area, he moved furniture to position vantage points near the windows, verifying sightlines and possible cover. Though no direct threat emerged under the cover of darkness, he remained on edge, every sense tuned to the possibility of assault. She dozed fitfully, but he scarcely slept at all. Memories of past battles, both known and unknown to the public, returned to him. Those recollections reminded him that sometimes a single act of defiance could set an entire cascade of events into motion. Morning eventually arrived with an uncertain light, revealing the ranch in full. The dirt driveway, the simple tool shed, the penned livestock, all looked ordinary enough, yet a weight of impending consequences pressed on them as tangibly as the summer heat. He saw the worry etched into her features and assured her, without words, that they would not remain there to be sitting targets. She seemed torn. The ranch was her home, and every plank of wood felt like a piece of her heritage, but she recognized the logic. The mafia boss would not let this offense pass without retaliation, and staying behind those walls would be perilous. They formed a decision: they would leave the ranch, at least for a time, in hopes of finding a temporary refuge. The authorities could not be trusted, as she had repeatedly indicated. A quiet departure under cover of early morning might offer a chance to evade watchful eyes. With uneasy determination, she gathered a few essentials into a small bag, each item pulled from cupboards and drawers with a resigned sense that she might not return for quite some time. He made his own preparations, verifying that his Colt had enough ammunition and checking for any additional supplies that could be adapted for self-defense. There was no telling how many men would come in pursuit once word spread of last night's incident. Before they departed, he scanned the immediate area, the field stretching out before them, the stillness that seemed almost mocking after the violence. He led her to where his motorcycle stood, gleaming in the new daylight. Neither took comfort in illusions. They both understood that departing was only the first step in an extended fight for safety. Yet a resolute calm pervaded his bearing, as though he carried within him the certainty that evil would not prevail, and that, if necessary, he would confront it again and again. With the echoes of that night's chaos still fresh in the air, they made their exit, the bike carrying them away from the ranch house that had been violated by cruelty and into a world that, though vast, felt immediately hostile. The farmland that had once seemed so peaceful now felt laden with the threat of unseen eyes. Leaving the ranch behind them, he could not shake the thought that this act of rescue had ignited a fuse leading to a powder keg of retaliation. Still, there was no alternative but to keep moving, protect the innocent, and trust in the resilience of those who refused to be cowed by brutality. So began their journey away from the ranch, a path that would take them through dangers both known and unseen, orchestrated by the very crime syndicate he had inadvertently challenged. Though uncertain about the precise form that danger would take, he accepted his role as guardian with a calm finality, shoulders squared against the storms that would inevitably gather in their wake. Their departure from the ranch carried a tense undercurrent that weighed heavily in the warm morning air. He guided the motorcycle along a narrow dirt road, its winding course weaving through fields of sun-baked crops and occasional clusters of wildflowers that lined the edges. The young woman behind him clung with hesitant strength, her arms wrapped around his waist, every jolt in the road prompting a flash of anxiety. The events of the previous night had left their imprint on both of them, and it was impossible to ignore the dread of what might come next. The farmland stretched outward in every direction, deceptively tranquil under a gentle sun. Yet an invisible threat loomed behind every stray gust of wind and every idle passing vehicle. The next few miles passed in taut silence. He maintained a steady pace, conscious of how exposed they were in an open landscape. A single dust cloud on the horizon could signal a pursuing truck, and the occasional glimmer of metal in the distance might be the shine of a rifle scope. In that hush, the farmland itself seemed complicit, its broad expanses and winding routes potentially concealing a network of hidden watchers. He recalled the fearful way she had described the local mafia boss's reach, how it extended into law enforcement and overshadowed every corner of town. Instinct told him they had scant time before the man's wrath would manifest in the form of armed enforcers scouring the roads. They encountered a narrow bridge spanning a shallow creek, the water reflecting the sky's soft blue. He slowed enough to peer cautiously around before proceeding, mindful that a sniper or a barricade could turn this simple crossing into a trap. The bridge groaned under the weight of the bike, but no threat emerged. On the far side, the land rose into gently rolling hills dotted with the occasional outbuilding, some worn by disuse, others revealing small signs of habitation. Though the route offered glimpses of countryside beauty, neither could fully appreciate it. Survival took priority over reflection. They pressed on, guided by an urgent sense that they had to cover ground swiftly. Before long, they reached a dirt crossroads where a faded wooden sign indicated two possible directions, one toward the nearest highway leading to a small city, and another deeper into rural territory. He pulled the bike over near the signpost, its chipped paint and leaning frame suggesting that few travelers used this path. She slid off the seat, wincing as she straightened her stiff limbs. Dust swirled around them, and only the soft rustle of a distant breeze broke the silence. In the openness of that intersection, they were vulnerable, but they had to decide on a path. She hesitantly pointed in the direction of the city, explaining in subdued tones that her father had sometimes sold produce there at market stalls. Yet that urban center lay under the thumb of the mafia boss, his presence deeply rooted in everything from commerce to local government. The likelihood of immediate recognition or an orchestrated ambush in crowded streets was dangerously high. Even so, that route might also lead them toward better resources, medical help if needed, and possibly a means to slip away if they managed to stay hidden. The alternative, heading further out into the rural backcountry, presented a different set of hazards. Fewer eyes meant fewer witnesses, but also fewer places to hide if the enemy discovered their trail. He weighed both options in silence. A lifetime of solitary decision-making had honed in him a capacity for quick judgment, unclouded by hesitation. He pointed toward the route leading away from the city, away from the known centers of mafia influence. There would be time, later, to find a path to safety. For now, minimizing immediate exposure felt paramount. She nodded, recognizing that logic dictated they sidestep heavily populated areas until they had a stronger sense of how closely the net might be drawing around them. A quiet understanding passed between them. Their journey would be neither comfortable nor simple. They returned to the motorcycle, and once again the engine's low rumble filled the space where words remained unspoken. He guided it onto the less traveled dirt road, which led past neglected farms and expanses of meadow. Each mile placed greater distance between them and the ranch, yet the memory of that night's violence remained sharp. She periodically glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting a black SUV to crest the hill behind them at any moment. The tension in her posture mirrored his own heightened vigilance. Though his expression revealed little, inside he braced for trouble. The ride eventually brought them to a sparsely inhabited region characterized by scrubland and stunted trees. A wiry fence followed the contours of the road, swaying in certain places where posts had collapsed. Overhead, the sun inched higher, warming the air. Their water supply was modest, and as the hours passed, thirst gnawed at them. He slowed when they reached a withered gas station that appeared abandoned, its roof buckling, windows boarded, and a single rusted pump out front. Weeds pushed up through the cracked concrete around the station. It offered the slightest bit of shade beneath a corrugated metal awning. He brought the bike to a stop there, scanning the surroundings for any sign of recent activity. An eerie quiet hung over the place, broken only by the creak of old metal in the breeze. The pump looked defunct, with a dusty gauge unreadable behind a spiderwebbed glass pane. Still, they needed a moment's respite. The girl dismounted first, stretching her arms and shoulders. Her eyes darted, distrustful of this half-ruined haven, but also grateful for the chance to catch her breath. He approached the single door that led inside. With careful steps, he tested it, locked from within. The windows offered only darkness, no sign of movement. He moved around to peer through a gap in one boarded pane. The interior looked stripped of anything valuable, a husk of a once functional station. It offered no shelter beyond being four walls and a roof. They settled near the awning, the only spot shielding them from the intensifying sunlight. She rummaged through her bag for a small plastic bottle and passed it to him, letting him take a sip before taking one herself. The water was lukewarm and already halfway depleted. He frowned slightly, calculating how far they could travel before dehydration became a concern. The countryside seemed in no hurry to provide them with a fresh source of water or immediate escape. Despite this uncertainty, the air around them felt marginally safer than it had earlier. Nothing stirred on the roads behind them, and no random vehicles appeared on the horizon. Yet that peace shattered when the distant growl of engines became perceptible. It started as a low hum, too faint to identify clearly, but steadily grew in volume. She tensed, glancing at him in alarm. He gestured for her to stay out of sight. Swiftly, he pushed the motorcycle behind the gas station to conceal it from the road, urging her to crouch near a pile of discarded wooden pallets. He stood at the station's corner, peering around just enough to see what approached. A pair of black SUVs roared into view, dust pluming behind their tires. The vehicles looked new, tinted windows giving no hint of who was inside. They slowed as they neared the derelict station, tires crunching gravel. The lead SUV pulled into the lot, idling near the single pump. Several seconds of tense silence followed before the passenger door opened and a man stepped out. He wore dark jeans, a collared shirt, and a menacing glare that traveled over the surroundings. His posture radiated aggression, and the way he kept a hand near his belt suggested he was armed. Another figure emerged from the second SUV, similarly dressed. They spoke to each other in hushed, clipped tones, scanning the area as though expecting to find someone. One kicked debris near the pump, scanning the ground for fresh tire tracks or footprints. They were searching for signs of recent activity, perhaps a motorcycle or two sets of footprints that would confirm their quarry was close. From his vantage, Chuck observed them with a cool detachment, measuring the risk. They were definitely not random travelers. Their coordinated actions and sense of purpose signaled a direct link to the mafia boss. The men paced around, occasionally eyeing the boarded windows of the station. She remained behind the pallets, shoulders hunched, eyes closed to steady herself. If these men discovered them, a conflict would erupt, and the location provided no easy escape routes. He judged the men's weaponry by the outlines beneath their shirts. Handguns, possibly something more. The advantage was that they had no idea where he and the girl might be, if they were even there at all. Every second that passed felt stretched taut with potential violence. If the intruders moved around the side of the station, they would stumble across the motorcycle, and then discovery would be inevitable. At length, a third man emerged from the leading SUV's back seat, brandishing a phone. This one seemed to issue instructions, or perhaps receive them. His expression darkened in frustration. An exchange followed, gestures indicating that they believed their targets, likely the girl and whoever had defended her, must have fled out of town. One of them examined tire ruts in the dirt, probably trying to gauge direction. The presence of a half-buried sign near the station's entrance suggested old maintenance vehicles might have used this route in the past, making the track inconclusive. Agitation spiked in their curt gestures. Their voices rose enough for fragments of curses and references to the mafia boss to carry in the quiet air. Eventually, the men seemed convinced that the station held no leads. One spat onto the ground, a sharp motion betraying irritation. They climbed back into the SUVs, doors slamming with a dull thud. Engines revved, and the vehicles circled once around the lot, raising another cloud of dust, before picking up speed and disappearing down the dirt road in the direction Chuck and the girl had chosen not to go. The sound faded, leaving behind only swirling traces of grit in the wind. He waited a moment longer, ensuring they weren't doubling back, then signaled for her to join him. Their relief was palpable but cautious. She emerged from her hiding place, eyes darting toward the road where the SUVs had vanished. He stepped around the station to confirm that no occupant had stayed behind. Certain they were alone, he directed her to the bike. Their moment of rest, such as it had been, was over. The mafia's reach had found them this far out, which meant no dusty corner of the region was truly safe. They had to keep moving, remain unpredictable, and hope to stay a step ahead. He guided the bike onto the road again, ignoring the dryness in his throat and the tight ache in his muscles. She clasped her arms around him once more, anxiety returning as swiftly as the engine's rumble. They took a winding route, bypassing more direct roads in favor of lesser trails. The terrain alternated between scraggly brush and patches of farmland that had seen better days. Occasionally, they glimpsed small homesteads or ranch houses set back from the road, but the fear of leading danger to someone's doorstep kept them from stopping. By late afternoon, the sun bore down mercilessly, turning the road into a shimmering stretch of dust. He spotted a neglected orchard in the distance, rows of fruit trees drooping in the heat. It looked long abandoned, the fruit either rotted or gone to seed, but it offered potential for shade. He steered toward it, weaving around a sagging fence. Under the canopy of branches, the air felt marginally cooler. They parked near a section of broken irrigation pipe that once provided water to the orchard. The ground was softer here, scattered with fallen leaves and decaying fruit that gave off a pungent tang. Though hardly an oasis, it was a reprieve from the direct glare of the sun. She dismounted and leaned against a trunk, breathing heavily, the stress of the day etched into her features. He removed a small canteen from a saddlebag, his own emergency supply, though dangerously low. He let her drink first, then took a measured sip, mindful of the hours of daylight left. They shared a mutual wariness, scanning the orchard for any sign of watchers. The hush around them felt oddly tranquil, broken occasionally by a crow's call or the rustle of dried branches overhead. She explained in a hushed tone that the mafia boss undoubtedly had men in law enforcement. The highways leading out of the county would be monitored by corrupt police waiting to intercept them. Rumors circulated in local circles about an even broader manhunt, once the boss set his sights, the bounty he offered spread quickly through criminal networks. The mention of a large sum, possibly $1 million, lingered like a malevolent specter. Under the heat of the orchard, both recognized that every petty outlaw in the region might now be scouring the roads for a chance to claim that reward. He considered a plan: remain off the major routes, keep to hidden trails until they could find a secure hideout or perhaps even leave the state. The resources, however, were not on their side. They carried only what they could fit on the motorcycle, had limited ammunition for the Colt, and faced an opponent with near limitless manpower. Yet defeat was not in his vocabulary. His calm, unshakable demeanor conveyed that they would adapt, step by step, no matter how desperate the circumstances. That silent confidence seemed to restore a measure of composure to her. If he showed no sign of panic, then perhaps there was hope. Evening gradually settled in, painting the sky with pink and orange streaks. The orchard silhouettes took on an eerie beauty, the gnarled branches reaching like twisted arms. They needed somewhere less conspicuous to rest for the night. Although the orchard could hide them temporarily, the risk of being discovered out in the open was too high. He recalled an old trick from bygone roads, a small network of travelers who sometimes used barns or derelict farm structures as makeshift safe houses. Sometimes these places were left unlocked, part of an unspoken code of rural courtesy, though modern desperation often overshadowed such courtesies. He ventured deeper into the orchard on foot, leaving her momentarily with the bike. To his relief, he discovered a small storage building near the far corner. Its door hung off rusted hinges, and the interior smelled of dirt and stale air. But it was at least enclosed and better sheltered than sleeping in the open orchard. He stepped inside, scanning for signs of rodents or anything more threatening. A few old crates and a tattered tarp were scattered about, but no immediate hazards. The space would suffice as a hidden campsite if they remained quiet and concealed their bike nearby. She joined him after a few minutes, guided by his quiet gesture. They wheeled the motorcycle behind a dense stand of trees, partially cloaking its outline with broken branches and brush. The building structure stood stable enough to keep them off the open ground, though the wooden walls had gaps where the setting sun's light poked through. Once inside, they sank against the wall, exhaustion radiating from every muscle. They shared what remained of the water, a stark reminder that tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, chief among them finding a fresh supply. The evening light dimmed. In the half-darkness, a profound weariness settled on them both. He surveyed the interior of the storage shed, noting the points of entry and considering how best to respond if anyone stumbled upon them. Though his eyes felt heavy, he knew rest would come in fragments, always overshadowed by vigilance. The orchard beyond the walls rustled with nocturnal life, insects and small creatures stirring among fallen fruit. The hush within was broken only by their breathing, the muffled sound of two fugitives caught in a web of corruption far-reaching and lethal. She mustered courage to voice a few details of her story, about how her family had owned that ranch for generations, how her father passed away leaving her to manage the property, and how the mafia boss seized upon her vulnerability. Burdensome debts, protection fees, veiled threats, each method used to corner her had been part of a larger strategy to claim her land. The men who had attacked her had done so with impunity, assured that no one would intervene. That assumption was shattered when Chuck arrived. But the blowback was unstoppable. The boss's fury would be unleashed in full force to restore his reputation and crush any resistance. He listened in silence, absorbing the weight of her account. Each word reinforced his conviction that he had been right to step in. Even if the path forward was riddled with peril, he would not abandon her. Honor, loyalty, and an innate sense of justice demanded it. Yet rationality warned that time was not on their side. The enemy's network spanned every dusty road, every unscrupulous corner. Tomorrow or the day after, confrontation would be inevitable. Better to choose their ground and method than to wait for fate to corner them. Night fell in earnest, and the orchard outside turned into a dark silhouette under a canopy of stars. He sat watch while she drifted into a shallow sleep, tension still carved into her features. From a gap in the building's wall, he glimpsed the moon rising amid faint clouds, illuminating the scattered trees. It was a strangely serene tableau for a world that had become so deadly. He let his thoughts wander briefly to the roads he had traveled before this, the times he sought respite in quiet places. Serenity, it seemed, always proved elusive for a man who attracted conflict like a magnet to iron. The hours crawled by in this uneasy vigil. Occasionally, he heard a distant engine rumble across the orchard, but none drew close enough to rouse immediate alarm. The immensity of the sky above made him feel both connected to a greater universe and sharply aware of his small stance against a vast criminal enterprise. Dawn arrived slowly, first lighting the eastern horizon with a pale glow that seeped between the orchard trees. She stirred, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar setting, and then recollection brought a renewed heaviness to her eyes. They shared a glance that contained equal parts fatigue and determination. One day had passed, and here they were, concealed in a decrepit orchard storage shed, more uncertain than ever about how to outmaneuver a man whose pockets ran deep and whose wrath was merciless. But Chuck's posture, as he rose to inspect the orchard, left no doubt that retreat or surrender was not an option. His mind was already churning through possible routes, safe houses, or abandoned hideouts further along the county lines. He knew the day's heat would be upon them soon, complicating travel. Yet motion was necessary. They stepped outside to greet the morning, the orchard bathed in a soft, golden haze. He noted the dryness in the air, felt the grit on his skin. They had to replenish water, avoid detection, and push onward. The planning felt as challenging as any confrontation, for every detail could be the difference between escape and capture. The sun cleared the horizon, intensifying its glow across the orchard floor. In the distance, birds flitted between branches, calling to one another. This fleeting beauty contrasted painfully with their predicament. He motioned for her to ready the motorcycle. She understood the unspoken instruction that they could not linger here another full day, not with so many potential eyes scanning the backroads. Securing what few belongings they had, they returned to the bike. The orchard receded behind them, trees disappearing in the swirl of dust. Ahead stretched a lonely stretch of road, the next chapter in their flight. Miles would be long, thirst persistent, and the shadow of the mafia boss's vengeance omnipresent. Yet his resolve was unwavering. For her safety, and for the principle that violence could not go unanswered, he would push forward. She leaned into him on the seat, clutching at his jacket in a gesture that mixed desperation with trust. He guided the machine onto the open road, eyes searching the horizon for any shape that might threaten their precarious freedom. They disappeared down that path, two figures etched against the sprawl of farmland, forging onward into a new day in deeper perils, neither knowing how close danger might already be. The morning sun climbed higher, a silent witness to the promise and dread that lay ahead. In the distance, an engine note drifted on the wind, too faint to identify. The chase, after all, was far from over. Morning light spread across the open road, revealing the subtle undulations of a landscape shaped by both nature and weary human hands. Chuck Norris guided the motorcycle over worn asphalt that cracked in places, the edges choked by dusty weeds. The young woman sat behind him, maintaining a tense, watchful silence, occasionally stealing glances behind them. In her mind lingered images of black SUVs and grim-faced enforcers, their eyes brimming with malice. The orchard had provided only a brief respite, they could spare no further delay. Survival demanded constant motion, especially now that a bounty hovered over them, attracting every unscrupulous opportunist for miles around. They traveled for over an hour in near total silence, broken only by the thrum of the bike's engine and the subdued rustle of wind tugging at their clothes. The sun continued its ascent, intensifying the heat of a region that rarely knew mercy in summer. Fields, both thriving and fallow, stretched on either side of the road, bearing witness to the silent exodus of people whose livelihoods had become untenable under mafia intimidation. In occasional pockets of greenery, workers toiled in stoic acceptance, heads bowed beneath hats as if trying to escape notice. Yet even from a distance, Chuck could see how guarded they looked, an entire county conditioned by fear, mindful of who might be watching. By late morning, the road narrowed until it merged with a local highway used more frequently by cargo trucks and battered pickups. He approached that junction warily. The highway, though offering faster travel, presented an increased risk of detection from passing police vehicles or roving mafia scouts. Yet options were painfully limited. Rural side roads were often dead ends, or riddled with hazards that could trap them if a chase commenced. With a swift scan of the area, he angled the bike onto the highway, maintaining a steady speed, neither too fast to invite police attention nor too slow to appear conspicuous. The young woman clutched him more tightly, muscles tensed as if anticipating trouble at every bend. Traffic along the highway was sparse, but enough to keep them on edge. A few battered cars passed in the opposite lane, drivers uninterested in anything but reaching their destinations. Occasionally, a commercial truck thundered by, rattling them with gusts of displaced air. Each time a vehicle crested the horizon behind them, the tension flared anew. Their eyes flicked to mirrors, searching for any sign of tinted windows or the black sheen of an SUV. For long stretches, the asphalt rolled out before them in unbroken calm. Still, the hush felt uneasy. $1 million bounty had a way of slithering through rumor mills at miraculous speed, drawing the most unpredictable threats into the open. They rode on until midday. The sun blazed overhead, merciless and unrelenting, and an empty ache of thirst gnawed at them both. The water in his canteen was down to its final sips. She tapped his shoulder at a certain point, and he drifted the bike to the shoulder of the highway, stopping beneath a scraggly mesquite tree that offered minimal shade. Their throats were parched, their skin coated in sweat and road dust. They had to find water soon or risk dehydration. He glanced across the highway. Far in the distance, an old sign rose from the brush, announcing the presence of a small roadside diner. The building's roof shimmered with heat distortion, and a few vehicles occupied its dirt lot. It was impossible to know if it would be safe, but they had no choice. They had to risk it. He started the engine once more and carefully merged back onto the blacktop, guiding them toward that distant diner. Nerves buzzed through them both. Public spaces were dangerous. Any patron could be an informant or a willing gunman looking to profit off the bounty. But basic needs outweighed caution. As they drew closer, the diner came into clearer view, a low, squat building with sun-faded paint and a single gas pump out front. A sign in chipped lettering read, "Martha's Pit Stop," flanked by dusty windows that revealed dim interior lights. A couple of old trucks and one sedan sat out front. No suspicious SUVs, at least not at first glance. He parked near the building's side, trying not to be conspicuous. A pair of travelers emerged from the diner's entrance, heading to their vehicle without giving a second look to the new arrivals. He and the young woman shared a quick, silent assessment. If the place was truly innocent, they might grab water, perhaps a bite to eat, then slip away before trouble caught up. If danger lurked inside, a confrontation could spark in close quarters. Nevertheless, dehydration pressed them forward. Crossing the threshold, they entered a space that smelled of coffee, frying oil, and stale cigarettes. The lights were dim, giving the interior a yellowish hue. A jukebox stood silent in one corner, and a row of red vinyl booths lined the opposite wall. Behind the counter, a tired-eyed waitress watched them with polite curiosity. Only two other customers appeared present, an older couple sharing a meal, focusing more on their plates than on the newcomers. Chuck eased onto a stool at the counter, and the young woman settled beside him. The waitress placed two plastic menus in front of them, but he quietly motioned for water first. She obliged, returning with two large glasses. They drank in cautious sips, letting the cool liquid soothe parched throats. A portion of that dread that had weighed on them seemed to dissipate, at least temporarily. Around them, the diner's hum was subdued and free of tension. Perhaps this place stood outside the immediate influence of local corruption, or at least the staff here did not seem hostile. After conferring in murmured undertones, they ordered a modest meal, an omelette for her, a grilled sandwich for him. The waitress shuffled away, and for a few minutes, the steady whir of an aging ceiling fan provided the only soundtrack. Still, he did not lower his guard. From the corner of his eye, he watched the door. At any moment, a group of toughs could walk in, tipped off that a motorcycle matching a certain description had pulled in. Every time a vehicle rumbled past outside, his senses prickled. The older couple eventually rose to pay their check, then stepped out. That left the diner nearly empty except for Chuck, the young woman, and the worn-out staff. The waitress returned, set their plates down, and offered a shy, uncertain smile, perhaps sensing the underlying tension. They ate slowly, mindful that each second spent in one place magnified the chance of detection. Halfway through their meal, a policeman entered, a deputy, judging by his uniform and dusty cruiser parked outside. He took a seat at the far end of the counter, greeting the waitress with a friendly nod. She poured him coffee, and they exchanged small talk about the heat, the quiet roads, how seldom they got travelers these days. Chuck kept his eyes lowered, focusing on the food as though unaffected. But his pulse quickened. The mention of how seldom travelers came through put an unwelcome spotlight on them as newcomers. Their presence wouldn't go unnoticed. The deputy's casual posture signaled no immediate suspicion, but corrupt alliances ran thick in these parts, and a sheriff's badge didn't guarantee integrity. The young woman stiffened. The desire to flee welled up in her eyes, but he gently pressed his foot against hers under the counter, encouraging composure. Exiting abruptly could alert the deputy. Better to maintain a veneer of normality, finish the meal, pay, and leave. He silently reminded himself to avoid any overt hints, no glances that might betray fear, no sudden gestures. So they took small bites, sipped water, and forced calm expressions. The deputy sipped his coffee, occasionally glancing at them. His uniform bore the county's emblem, the same county they had left behind under a cloud of violence. He exchanged a few more words with the waitress, referencing some disturbance in the region, a possible scuffle out by an abandoned station, or the orchard, or maybe the ranch. Chuck couldn't parse every word, but bits of the conversation drifted over, references to gunshots, a woman. The deputy's tone was casual, but the subtext clenched the air around them like a vice. The waitress responded in an uncertain murmur that she had heard rumors but no specifics. The deputy shrugged, took another swig of his coffee, and said something about continuing his patrol shortly. Tension stretched within Chuck's chest like a bowstring drawn tight. He signaled the waitress for the check. She obliged, setting a small slip of paper beside him. The amount was modest, but he paid with cash well above it, leaving a tip that would hopefully discourage questions. In the periphery of his vision, he noticed the deputy glancing their way again, perhaps curious about these strangers. The deputy asked the waitress something Chuck couldn't fully discern, a question that might have been as simple as, "Who are they?" or as pointed as, "Are those the ones?" The waitress looked uncertain. Chuck stood, the young woman following suit, and headed for the door with calm, measured strides. Their shoulders tensed when the deputy cleared his throat, but he did not speak to them. He merely turned back to the waitress, placing some bills on the counter. Chuck stepped through the door, exhaling a silent breath of relief. The midday sun struck them like a wall of heat. Moving quickly, they returned to the motorcycle. He checked the small side mirror reflexively. The deputy could appear at any moment, asking for IDs or, worse, pulling a weapon. But no immediate pursuit emerged from the diner's entrance. The policeman's cruiser remained parked where it was. He kicked the bike into gear, and they pulled away from Martha's pit stop, wind sweeping against them, carrying away the stifling sense of near capture. In their wake, the diner's neon sign buzzed under the harsh sun, oblivious to the undercurrent of fear that had just passed through its domain. They continued down the highway for another half hour, each mile offering a reprieve from potential confrontation yet drawing them closer to unknown dangers. The region's geography shifted subtly, fields gave way to low hills dotted with thorny shrubs. The road twisted, occasionally forcing them to slow for tight bends where large boulders and desert vegetation encroached. In these winding passages, vantage points multiplied for anyone wanting to set an ambush. His eyes scanned the ridgelines, searching for silhouettes or the glint of glass that might signal a rifle scope. The young woman kept an equally sharp lookout behind them, her grip unwavering. Eventually, a sign indicated a fork, left leading to a small settlement by the name of Los Oteros, right continuing along the highway toward a more distant county. The settlement might offer rest, perhaps a place to replenish supplies, but it also might be thoroughly compromised by the local underworld. Their brief attempt at the diner had succeeded without bloodshed, but only barely. Danger sometimes lay in the places that felt most ordinary. He weighed these thoughts. Then he glimpsed a cluster of dark shapes in the far distance on the highway, the approach of multiple vehicles. A direct meeting on open asphalt could prove disastrous if those vehicles carried men loyal to the boss. He veered left, taking the route toward Los Oteros. The road soon dipped into a valley, the landscape around them showing signs of farmland once more, though dryness choked the earth. They passed rusted fences, old corrals, and a scattering of cacti. Los Oteros itself appeared as a handful of streets near a dried-up riverbed, a settlement that time seemed to have forgotten. Low-slung buildings with cracked stucco crowded around an aging central square. The place looked half-abandoned, yet a church bell stood tall at one end, and a battered sign welcomed visitors in peeling paint. If they could find a discreet corner here, maybe they could wait out those suspicious vehicles on the highway. They rode carefully through the settlement, drawing the guarded stares of a few townsfolk who leaned in doorways or rested against walls. Eyes followed them without warmth or overt hostility, just a tired curiosity that recognized them as outsiders. He spotted a boarded-up motel near the south edge of town, its lot overgrown with weeds. Once a humble traveler's stop, it now bore a vacancy sign that hadn't been lit in years. The main office window was cracked, and the parking area was deserted. A lonely relic of better days. He guided the bike there, hoping the neglected building might serve as temporary shelter. They pulled into the cracked lot. A battered fence enclosed the rear of the property, and the perimeter looked as though it hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. A corner suite had a door partially off its hinges. He left the bike out of sight behind a cluster of shrubs and approached the suite on foot. A push against the door made it clear the lock was broken. Inside, dust motes floated through stale air. Torn curtains hung by a single rod. The bed frame was intact but the mattress half-rotted. Drawers were pulled out and empty, like previous squatters had scavenged anything remotely valuable. She stood behind him, taking in the dismal space with a resigned expression. Yet it offered more immediate concealment than sleeping in open desert. He nodded, and they moved inside, gently shutting the door behind them. Fragments of old furniture cluttered the corners, chairs with missing legs, a small television that had been gutted of its electronics. The windows were grimy, but one could still peer through them to watch the street. He quickly checked each adjoining space, the minuscule bathroom, a closet filled with debris. No one else was here. They took a moment to rest. The tension of the day, combined with the unrelenting sun, sapped their energy. He located a corner that allowed him a decent view of the window and doorway simultaneously, then laid a strip of broken wood against the door. An improvised barricade that wouldn't stop determined force but might give them a warning. She settled on the remains of the old mattress, tucking her legs beneath her as though trying to make herself small. The dryness still nagged at them both. At least the diner's water had bought some time before dehydration became a dire threat. They passed a few hours in that dusty room, the heat pressing in from outside. The old walls did little to keep out the baking sun, but the shade was still better than braving direct exposure. From time to time, footsteps passed on the street, or the sound of a distant engine rumbled by. They remained silent. He used a cloth to wipe his face, mentally cataloging ammunition and possible escape routes. The memory of those vehicles on the highway stayed with him. If they were indeed mafia enforcers, they would keep searching, branching off onto side roads, questioning townsfolk, threatening them until someone gave away the presence of a man traveling with a young woman. Afternoon stretched into early evening, the light shifting from harsh brightness to an amber glow that filtered through cracks in the boarded windows. Hunger gnawed at them, but the heavier burden was the knowledge that every additional hour in this region invited confrontation. She mentioned in a quiet tone that the mafia boss's power extended beyond mere force. He manipulated commerce, extorted local farmers, and used fear as currency. A town like Los Oteros might offer no help if asked. People here simply wanted to survive, even if it meant looking the other way. She also emphasized that a direct confrontation with his men was inevitable. Sooner or later, they'd have to either slip past the entire region or confront the tyranny head-on. Chuck listened, his thoughts weighing the practicalities of each approach. Running indefinitely was untenable, especially with $1 million bounty fueling the chase. At some point, the mafia boss would unleash every resource to corner them. Already, that network of corrupt lawmen, hired guns, and eager opportunists was on alert. And the woman, forced to abandon her home, had nowhere left to run if this pursuit continued. He mulled over the seeds of a plan that might solve things more definitively, but the risk was immense. Taking down the mafia boss meant returning to that stronghold of corruption. It meant standing against the entire apparatus of his organization, which had thrived for years by crushing any dissent. Night approached. The room's stale air cooled slightly. He rose from his makeshift seat to peer through the window. The street lay mostly empty, illuminated by a flickering lamppost in the middle of the square. Occasionally, a figure crossed the intersection, head down, hurried. Across the way, an old grocery with dim lights remained open, though it looked about to close. They needed supplies, if only to replenish water. Leaving her behind was risky. Taking her along was also fraught. But it had to be done. He motioned for her to wait while he scouted. She nodded, unwilling but resigned to the necessity. Prying the door open again, he stepped into the twilight. He moved with the fluid caution of someone used to stealth, each footfall measured on the crumbling asphalt. Lights shone in a few windows around the town, but no suspicious vehicles or groups of men stood out. Reaching the grocery took only a short walk, and inside, a solitary overhead fixture hummed with weak fluorescence. Wooden shelves displayed basic staples, canned goods, dried beans, a small fridge with bottled drinks. The proprietor, an older woman with graying hair, offered a cautious greeting. He forced a smile, selected a few essential items, bottled water, some bread, a can of vegetables, jerky that might sustain them if cooking was impossible. He paid in cash. The woman regarded him with an inscrutable look, as though deciding whether to say more, but in the end, she simply handed him change. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes, yet he felt tension thrumming in his veins the entire time. Once back outside, he scanned the area for watchers, saw none, and quickly slipped back to the deserted motel. The short journey felt longer under the weight of potential danger, but no alarm sounded, no men jumped from the shadows. For now, they appeared to remain unrecognized. He re-entered the motel room, finding her as he'd left her, still, quiet, though eyes flicking to the door the moment he returned. She breathed a sigh of relief. They shared the water and some of the jerky, an unremarkable meal that nonetheless felt like a small victory. The gloom in the room weighed heavily on them both, but the knowledge that they now had enough supplies to last another day or so offered a measure of comfort. Afterward, he stepped out into the parking lot once more, this time to check on the motorcycle under the fading light. It remained undisturbed behind the shrubs, a faint layer of dust settling on the metal. Later, as the moon rose, they settled into a restless vigil. The plan for the coming days remained vague: keep moving when dawn broke, skirt major routes, inch closer to a boundary they could cross to relative safety. Yet neither believed that departure would solve everything. The mafia boss's fury would continue to plague them, whether or not they crossed a county or state line. And that unspoken truth hung in the silence between them. He recognized the moral imperative that had woven itself into his bones from the moment he rescued her. Honor demanded a reckoning, a refusal to let men like that boss continue their reign of terror unchallenged. When sleep finally caught up to them in brief, uneasy intervals, it was a shallow rest steeped in tension. Dreams, if they came at all, were tinted with half-formed images of black vehicles and deserted fields. Outside, a warm wind whispered through the decrepit buildings of Los Oteros. Occasionally, a dog barked in the distance, but the night was otherwise still. No roar of engines signaled an imminent raid, and no silhouette broke down the door. Yet the darkness remained thick with the awareness of how precarious their peace truly was. Morning eventually tiptoed in, a faint light creeping through the broken boards over the windows. He woke first, scanning the small room for anything amiss. She stirred soon after, fatigue evident in the slump of her shoulders. Without spoken agreement, they gathered their meager belongings, preparing for another day's flight. As they stepped onto the motel walkway, the town looked exactly as it had the previous evening, worn, quietly resigned, the streets already warming under the sun. In the square, a few locals emerged to open shops or sweep doorsteps. Their expressions carried the weight of people accustomed to hardship. They considered a stealthy exit, but a more pressing reality settled on them like a tangible weight. They had to find a workable strategy, something beyond indefinite evasion. It didn't take many words between them to reach a shared conclusion: if they continued simply running, the mafia's net would eventually tighten. Living forever as hunted fugitives was untenable. The only genuine resolution lay in confronting the power structure that hunted them. For Chuck, that meant an eventual return to the region where the boss held his court. For the young woman, it meant risking everything to end the threat that had driven her from her own ranch. The notion was daunting, but every logical path circled back to it like the center of a maze. She breathed in, steeling herself, and nodded at him, an unspoken pledge to stand alongside him, or at least support whatever plan he devised. Still, they needed a safer vantage point from which to plot the next steps. Exposing themselves in Los Oteros for too long risked a tip-off. He guided her to the motorcycle. With a final glance at the deserted motel, they departed, the machine roaring gently to life in the early light. As they rolled through the settlement's dusty streets, a few townsfolk gave them guarded stares. He left in silence, uncertain whether someone might place a call after they were gone, but determined to make it a moot point by putting miles behind them. The highway awaited once again. By mid-morning, they were weaving through the same landscape of scrub and outcrops, eyes ever vigilant. They paused briefly to examine a set of abandoned railroad tracks that paralleled the highway, pondering whether traveling along them might be safer. Ultimately, the rails seemed too exposed in certain stretches, and the motorcycle's tires wouldn't handle debris-strewn gravel well. So they stuck to back roads that branched from the main route. These were the meandering veins connecting small ranches and homesteads, sometimes looping back on themselves or ending abruptly at private gates. The labyrinthine geography offered both concealment and the risk of being cornered. They found no easy path. Midday sun returned with scorching intensity, forcing them to break in the limited shade of a scraggly tree near a dried watercourse. Their supply of water, though replenished the previous night, was already shrinking, each gulp a precious necessity. They felt the pressing weight of time. Meanwhile, the mafia boss's network would not rest. The confrontation they half expected at every turn could erupt at any juncture. And still, they rode on. Eventually, the land dipped into a valley ringed by low hills, where dust trailed behind their tires like a signature in the wind. In the distance stood a barn, part of a ranch that looked neglected but not entirely abandoned. He steered the bike closer, hoping it might hold a functioning well or a quiet place to rest. The property's fence hung with rusted barbed wire, parted in sections. The barn itself bore chipped red paint, its doors ajar. Not a single animal roamed the grounds, but a battered pickup truck sat on the side, tires flat and windows missing. Signs of violence marked the walls, bullet holes, scorch marks. This place had seen conflict. Maybe it was once a site of defiance, now left to rot. He brought the motorcycle to a halt under the barn's overhang, scanning for signs of a recent presence. The silence was profound, the dryness palpable. She stepped off, peering into the barn's interior with a cautious expression. Bits of straw littered the dusty floor, drifting in the faint currents of wind. Hoof prints marked the dirt, though they seemed old. Against a back wall, empty stalls stood in a row. It had all the hallmarks of a place once thriving, now reclaimed by desolation. Nevertheless, it offered shade and potential cover. They moved inside, letting their eyes adjust to the dimness. Here, at least, they wouldn't be spotted from the road. He dismounted and rolled the bike under the partial cover of a broken loft, ensuring it remained out of sight. Satisfied that no one lurked in the corners, he motioned for her to rest. The day had already proven exhausting. She slid down against a wooden beam, pressing the back of her head to the rough surface, eyes closed for a moment's respite. He stood near the open barn door, scanning the horizon. Rusted farm equipment lay scattered around, a silent testament to a way of life interrupted. Bullet casings glinted in patches of sunlight. Memories of the mafia's intimidation possibly lingered here, though no living soul remained to speak of it. Absently, he towed at one of the spent shells, the weight of how deeply entrenched the violence had become settling into him. It reminded him again that running was only prolonging the inevitable confrontation. Dust motes swirled in a stray beam of sunlight, dancing lazily as if unaware of the tension humming through the man who observed them. He stepped out of the barn for a moment, scanning the ranch yard. His gaze swept over the battered truck, the sagging fence, the front porch of a modest cabin near the orchard's edge, which had a collapsed roof. Little suggested a functional water source. He listened, hearing no hum of electricity or pump. He approached an old well near the orchard, tested the pulley. A dry rasp answered him, it hadn't seen water in a long while. Returning to the barn, he found her still resting, but her expression haunted. She too had likely noticed the bullet holes, the signs of gunfire. Neither spoke of it, yet the unspoken understanding weighed heavily. This property was one of many that had stood against the mafia or refused to meet its demands. The outcome was evident, ruin and abandonment. Afternoon light began to shift. They would need to move soon, but the relentless chase had left them dangerously worn. The old barn, at least, provided a momentary lull. He rummaged through the barn's shadows, discovering a wooden bench and a couple of discarded tarps that might serve as bedding for an hour or two. He draped one tarp across the bench, gesturing for her to sit more comfortably. Taking her place, she exhaled a trembling breath. The tension of constant flight was draining her spirit, yet a spark of determination still lit her eyes. He considered their next steps. To truly end this threat, they would have to do more than evade the mafia boss's hired guns. They needed to strike at the man's seat of power, likely in or near the major town that served as his operational hub. This was where local officials cowered under his thumb and where he orchestrated the corruption of law enforcement. She had spoken of how her father's ranch had come under the mafia's yoke through escalating debts and threats. That same pattern had repeated across countless properties. If Chuck intended to secure her freedom and send a message that intimidation carried a steep price, it meant heading back into that stronghold with a deliberate plan. His own sense of justice, forged by years of dealing with bullies and criminals, bristled at the idea of these men continuing unopposed. And so the question, how best to dismantle the empire, or at least topple its figurehead, without guaranteeing their own demise in the process. They had only his Colt 1911, a limited supply of ammunition, and whatever resourcefulness he could muster. Yet in his lifetime, he had seen how the courage of a few could shift the balance against entrenched violence. Allies might be found among locals who'd had enough, or among the honest minority in law enforcement. But forging those alliances would require time and trust, a scarce commodity in a region gripped by terror. The sun lowered by degrees, turning the barn's interior from a bright haze into a series of soft-edged shadows. The air cooled slightly, offering relief from the day's heat. She dozed in brief spells, jolting awake whenever her thoughts drifted to the memory of men with guns or the knowledge that $1 million reward now beckoned every drifter to hunt them. He kept watch, each sense primed for the crunch of gravel or the distant roar of an engine. Despite the adrenaline fatigue gnawing at him, he refused to let down his guard. When the sky grew streaked with orange and purple, he gently shook her shoulder, signaling that dusk was the best time to resume traveling. Fewer watchers might be on the road, and darkness could cloak their movements better. She rose, collecting her scattered nerves. Together, they rolled the motorcycle out from under the loft. The machine's presence comforted him. It was a reminder they could still outrun some dangers, at least for a time. They pushed it into the open yard, away from the barn. Before starting the engine, he did one last scan of the property. The hush that lay over the place felt almost mournful. They set off, leaving behind the bullet-scarred barn and the orchard that once must have thrived. He guided the bike onto a back road that skirted the orchard's edge, dust kicking up in the twilight. Overhead, a waxing moon rose above the ridgeline. The warm wind teased the battered fences, and somewhere, an unseen coyote yipped at the fading day. Riding into the evening, they passed silent homesteads and neglected fields. The smell of night-blooming plants intertwined with the dusty tang of the road. She held on, posture rigid, half expecting an ambush around every bend. He felt her tension mirrored in his own heartbeat. Yet the countryside remained oddly still. Their single headlight cut a modest swath through the dusk, revealing a winding path that ascended into a series of rocky hills. Beyond those hills, the map in his head showed a route that could eventually circle back toward the main town, and thus, the epicenter of the mafia's operation. His decision crystallized as they traveled. They would find a more secure hiding place, then gather intelligence for a direct strike. It was the only way. Anything else was postponement, leaving them forever glancing over their shoulders. Accepting that burden, he increased speed, pressing on while the night offered concealment. A plan formed in half-finished fragments: identify the boss's lieutenants, locate the central hub of corruption, neutralize any enforcers, and corner the boss himself. Straightforward in concept, perilous in execution. The desire to keep the young woman safe added an extra layer of complication. She would not want to sit idle while he marched into the lion's den. Stars unveiled themselves overhead, scattered across a moonlit sky. The terrain grew rugged, forcing the bike to navigate hairpin turns that overlooked dark canyons. The far-off glow of an isolated ranch house would flicker once in a while, a lonely beacon in an expanse of wilderness. Their route eventually dipped into a valley, where the road turned to gravel, leading them past stunted pine trees. Here, the air felt cooler, almost crisp compared to the sweltering farmland. They slowed, conscious of how easily a miscalculation could send them sliding into a ditch. The hush felt deeper now, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of the wind in the pines. At length, they spied a small wooden sign, nearly swallowed by brush, indicating the presence of a campsite or public wilderness area. A dirt path branched off, vanishing between trees. Under normal circumstances, it might be a place for travelers or hikers. Possibly deserted now, it could serve as a quiet encampment for the night. He steered the bike onto this side path, bouncing over ruts and stones. After half a mile, they arrived at a clearing dotted with picnic tables and a dilapidated fire pit. No other vehicles or signs of campers greeted them. They dismounted, letting the engine fall silent. The hush was profound, broken only by crickets and a faint trickle of water somewhere in the dark. A small creek, perhaps. If so, it might solve their immediate water woes, albeit requiring caution about bacterial contamination. She set the packs on a weathered table. The moonlight filtered through tall pines, illuminating enough of the clearing for them to see the outlines of old facilities, an outhouse, a broken signboard, maybe an abandoned ranger station further in. The air smelled of pine needles, earth, and the promise of a cooler night. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a different world altogether, distant from the scorching farmland and menacing highways. He led her to the creek, following the soft sound of running water through a narrow trail. The stream was small but clear, reflecting the moon. He crouched, cupping a hand to drink, though mindful of potential contaminants. The taste was pure enough for immediate thirst, though caution suggested they might want to boil or filter it if possible. They filled what containers they had, grateful to replenish their reserves. Returning to the clearing, they situated themselves near a patch of relatively flat ground, hidden behind a row of pines so the motorcycle wouldn't be immediately visible from the dirt road. Sleep beckoned them both, but the edge of caution remained. He volunteered to keep watch while she caught a few hours of rest. She relented, too exhausted to argue, and rolled up in a spare tarp near the base of a tree, eyes already half closed. He settled against the trunk of another pine, gazing at the moonlit silhouettes around them. As she slept, he contemplated the final shape of the confrontation that lay ahead. Imagining the boss's fortress, a fancy compound or perhaps a well-guarded estate in the outskirts of the local city, he pictured a ring of armed thugs and bribed police, all standing ready to crush any direct assault. Then he recalled that old adage, underestimating a single determined adversary was the downfall of many powerful men. The boss, in his arrogance, might not truly believe that an aging stranger on a motorcycle could return to strike him at his core. The advantage, if any, lay in surprise and the willingness to risk everything for a cause greater than one's own safety. The evening deepened, stars intensifying overhead. The moon climbing to its apex. Around him, the forest teemed with soft nocturnal sounds, rustling leaves, a distant owl, the babbling creek. For a brief instant, the natural beauty almost dulled the edges of the grim future. But the weight of responsibility anchored him. He would protect her, and he would confront this evil, no matter the cost. So he remained vigilant, scanning the darkness for headlights or the crunch of boots on gravel. Only quiet reigned. It was deep into the night when the last remnant of tension in his muscles began to fade, replaced by a cautious calm. In that lull, he envisioned the path to come: infiltration, confrontation, possibly a one-man war against an empire of cruelty. At his side, the battered Colt 1911 glinted faintly, a reliable friend in an uncertain world. If fate demanded it, that sidearm would deliver justice, bullet by bullet. And so in the hush of a forest clearing, they reached another tenuous pause in the unrelenting chase, forging plans with silent resolve beneath a canopy of stars. The conflict with the mafia boss loomed like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and fierce. But in that quiet, pine-scented darkness, they drew strength from their shared purpose, prepared to face whatever dawn might bring. Night settled fully over the secluded forest clearing, enveloping Chuck Norris and his companion in an atmosphere of hushed anticipation. He remained awake through the deepest hours, listening for the faintest indication of an unwelcome presence. The sounds that reached him were instead the gentle stirrings of nocturnal creatures, woven into the steady trickle of the nearby creek. Within that tapestry of calm, he felt his mind sharpening around the inevitability of the conflict that lay ahead. Eventually, when his resolve demanded rest, he allowed himself only a brief interval, drifting into a half-sleep that preserved one ear for trouble. He roused her before dawn, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. She stirred beneath the tarp, confusion flitting across her face before memory settled in. She rubbed the fatigue from her eyes, and they both peered out at the graying sky. The forest canopy cast lingering shadows as they readied their gear with methodical efficiency. The previous evening's plan, to push closer to the crime boss's domain, remained an unspoken but unwavering decision. There was little logic in wandering aimlessly through the backwoods when the roots of their predicament lay deeper in the territory they had fled. Under the faint light, they drank from the creek again, scooping the chilled water to their mouths and filling their containers. Though caution about contaminants lingered, thirst overrode any reluctance. The clearing around them glowed in the gentle hush of early morning, pine needles crunched underfoot, and a scattered swirl of mist threaded among the trunks. Despite the ominous weight of their mission, the scene was serene, as if nature offered one final moment of grace before the trials ahead. Neither took it for granted. The motorcycle waited where they had left it, dew glistening on the metal. He wiped the moisture away with a corner of his shirt, checking the chain and tire pressure out of habit. Satisfied nothing had been tampered with, he helped her settle what little they carried. She cast a last, pensive look at the modest campsite, a fleeting refuge in a world otherwise consumed by violence, and nodded. He started the engine, careful not to throttle too aggressively, then guided the bike back onto the dirt trail that rejoined the road. The initial stretch of travel was uneventful, an unpaved route winding through hills that slowly dropped in elevation. As they descended, the pines thinned, replaced by lower brush and rocky outcrops. The warmth of morning soon announced itself, chasing away the final wisps of fog. They made decent time, crossing miles of uninhabited terrain. On occasion, a distant ranch house or lonely windmill broke the monotony, but there were no signs of the black SUVs that haunted her nightmares. By mid-morning, the landscape transitioned into the familiar dryness of high desert. The air tasted of dust again, and the horizon stretched with a muted sameness, low ridges, patches of hardy grass, and an unrelenting sky. An ache of tension pulsed through them both. They had left behind the relative anonymity of the forest and were now re-entering territory more densely connected by roads. Here, word of their presence might pass swiftly if they were spotted by the wrong eyes. They stopped briefly in the shade of a sandstone bluff, scanning a battered paper map he had kept folded in his pocket. The area was a patchwork of back roads leading into a cluster of small towns and, beyond that, the major township that served as a nucleus for the mafia boss's operations. She pointed to a faint dotted line marking an older service road, possibly used in the past by ranchers or local utility crews. He traced the route with a calloused finger, judging it might circumvent heavily trafficked highways. Without direct speech, they confirmed through small gestures that this circuitous path would lead them closer to the region's core without as much risk of police or mafioso patrols. They returned to the bike, pushing deeper into the desert. Every so often, the terrain forced them to slow, rutted ground or steep inclines threatened the balance. The sun climbed high, and thirst nagged anew. Their plan hinged on stealth and the element of surprise, but stealth required concealment, and the desert offered few such luxuries. He kept the bike's speed moderate, reducing the plume of dust behind them. She watched their rear with unblinking vigilance. Even the emptiest landscape could hide watchers if one failed to look closely. Hours slipped by in tense, steady travel until the sun's angle began to soften. They neared a range of craggy hills, each slope dotted with scrubby brush. The map suggested that on the far side lay a network of rural communities collectively under the thrall of the local mafia. Those enclaves, described in rumor and half-heard stories, formed the boss's outer ring of influence, a place where he tested new enforcers, extorted small businesses, and commanded farm exports. Venturing there unprepared was reckless, but turning back served no purpose. They paused in the shelter of a jagged rock outcrop to drink the last of their water. Neither spoke, yet both knew the critical moment was drawing near. He gestured for her to remain in cover while he climbed a short ridge on foot, seeking a vantage point. The climb was strenuous, sharp stones shifting beneath his boots. At the top, he crouched behind a formation that overlooked a wide valley. Far below, he observed scattered farmland in rectangular plots, with a dusty road winding through them. A few small houses and barns clustered near a shallow stream. Though his vantage could not distinguish individual details, he noticed an SUV parked in an open field, figures moving around it. Even from this distance, their purposeful motions suggested patrol or reconnaissance. They radiated an air of authority that aligned with the mafia's style. He remained there for long minutes, reading the land. That single SUV might be one of many. He studied the roads that branched out from the farmland, spotting a main artery that disappeared behind a line of trees. Perhaps it led toward the boss's seat of power, likely a larger town or estate. If he and the young woman approached openly, they would risk immediate detection. Deeper infiltration at night might be their best strategy. He eased back down the ridge, mindful of loose gravel. Rejoining her at the bike, he sketched a rough layout of what he had seen, tapping the approximate location of the farmland. They would wait until twilight to cross that valley. She nodded, and they used the lull of afternoon to gather themselves, each aware of the grave risk. If they were caught in open ground, flight might be impossible. Yet to do nothing would merely prolong the circle of pursuit. He sensed her trepidation, but also the unwavering steel of someone who had already lost everything to that empire of cruelty and now had little left to forfeit except her last shred of freedom. The hours until dusk passed slowly. Heat radiated from the rocks, swirling the air in mirages. They shared a bare minimum of food, packaged jerky and a stale roll, reserving the heavier meal for after their attempt to slip past the farmland. He performed a last check of the Colt 1911, ensuring each magazine was loaded, each mechanism functioning smoothly. She watched him, a silent question in her eyes about the violence that might come. He offered the slightest nod, as though to say he understood her fears. When the sun's blaze at last dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in ochre and crimson, they rose, brushed dust from their clothes, and mounted the motorcycle once more. The descent from the rocky hills was cautious and slow. The path zigzagged on loose gravel, and each turn threatened to betray them with a clatter that might carry in the still air. He steadied the bike with practiced skill, every muscle primed. At the base of the slope, the land leveled into a patchwork of farmland, though the soil looked parched. Cracked irrigation channels attested to sporadic water supply. The owners of these plots, if still present, presumably worked under the mafia's intimidation. The gloom of approaching night gave them partial cover, but also sharpened the tension of traveling through territory that could be filled with watchers. They approached a low ridge that overlooked the farm valley. The SUV was no longer visible. Perhaps it had moved or returned to a main road. The scattered houses below glimmered with faint lights, electricity likely regulated by the boss's chosen overseers. He kept the headlight on the bike switched off, using the last vestiges of twilight to navigate. Though vision was limited, the risk of showing a glaring beacon to potential enemies was far greater. She dismounted to walk alongside for especially uneven sections, reducing engine noise and further masking their presence. The hush was nearly complete, only the crunch of tires over dry earth or the quiet swirl of a breeze passing through scorched grass. Partway through the valley, they halted again. A rusted livestock gate blocked a dirt road. It was latched shut, though no sign indicated whether the property was still in use. Beyond the gate, a scattering of empty cattle pens and a large barn-like structure resembled so many others they had passed. He examined the chain and lock, a simple mechanism, not particularly robust. For a moment, he considered forging ahead, but the possibility of encountering armed men in the darkness made him pause. Instead, he guided the bike off to the side, through an overgrown path that skirted the fence. The brush scratched the motorcycle's frame, but they pressed on, eventually bypassing the locked gate without needing to break anything or announce their presence. They proceeded deeper, guided by an old track that connected outlying fields. In the faint moonlight, silhouettes of farm tools and sagging fences haunted the edges of their vision. An abandoned silo rose like a specter amid twisted scraps of metal. It seemed the entire region teetered between life and ruin, crops clinging to existence under duress, families perhaps too scared to maintain their land openly. The hush of night weighed heavily. They skirted the perimeter of another ranch, hearing muffled livestock sounds from a distance. A dim porch light glowed near the main house, indicating someone still lived there, but he steered them well clear to avoid any confrontation. The risk of a frightened resident calling in the mafia's enforcers was too high. Better to remain a phantom passing through farmland that no longer recognized normalcy. After hours of weaving through properties and side roads, they reached a point where the farmland began to transition into the outskirts of a larger settlement. The land flattened, and the roads gradually improved in quality. Fences gave way to scattered houses with more substantial construction. Fewer structures appeared run down, suggesting a closeness to the well-patrolled zones. Here, the aura of oppression felt more pronounced. The silhouettes of parked vehicles, some of them new and well-maintained, hinted at the presence of individuals operating with mafia money. Occasional columns of smoke from chimneys or the glow of streetlights revealed that this was no abandoned corner of the desert. It was the threshold of the boss's domain. They halted under a thick canopy of stunted oaks that clustered by the roadside, a hidden vantage offering a partial view of the outskirts. Through slender gaps between branches, Chuck spotted the dull shine of street lamps. The layout suggested a small suburban extension of a bigger town, a place where paved streets and modest houses gave way eventually to busier avenues. The core of that town, he suspected, was where the boss maintained his seat of power, an estate, perhaps, or a heavily guarded mansion, and offices dotted with crooked officials. He recalled the rumors of a local police station brimming with men on the boss's payroll. The young woman stood beside him, eyes following the faint patterns of light in the distance. She recalled enough from her own experiences to guess that the Central Authority building might be near the old city square, a vestige of more lawful days. Now, it served as little more than a facade behind which the mafia's leadership operated. Her expression revealed dread but also a quiet acceptance. This was the place where the final reckoning would be decided. He signaled for them to withdraw deeper into the trees. Charging forward without preparation would be reckless in the extreme. They needed a secure site from which to evaluate the town's defenses, identify patrols, and plan an approach that would catch the boss off guard. Under the boughs of the oaks, the moonlight filtered down in shards. The engine fell silent as he cut the ignition. They pushed the bike further into the undergrowth until it was all but invisible except at very close range. Exhaustion draped itself over them, the culmination of a day spent traversing hostile terrain, weighed down by the knowledge of what awaited. Still, no safe rest could be found so close to the enemy. They prowled a short distance on foot, scanning for any sign of watchers or hidden enforcers. Nothing stirred beyond the distant glow of street lamps. Satisfied for the moment, they settled in a hollow beneath the largest oak, using the base of its trunk as partial shelter from view. He placed the Colt 1911 on his lap, running a final check of each magazine. The upcoming confrontation might unfold in hours, or perhaps days, depending on what reconnaissance revealed. But the time for indefinite hiding was over. She retrieved a small knife from her bag, the only additional weapon they had managed to procure, and tucked it where she could reach it quickly. Beneath the hush of night, they had no illusions left. This was the threshold of war against a network that thrived on intimidation and bloodshed. Morning would bring reconnaissance, a careful creep into the outskirts to glean which buildings the mafia used, how they moved contraband, and where the boss might keep himself shielded. Perhaps they could locate an ally among the townsfolk who still resisted, if such a person existed. Or maybe infiltration under the cover of darkness would be the only option, searching for that fortress-like house they suspected. One thing was certain, the price on Chuck's head made it impossible for him to walk openly into the local diner or shop for information. She rested against the trunk, eyes half-lidded with weariness yet steeling her heart against the fear. He watched her briefly, recalling how that day at the ranch had begun as a solitary search for peace in a quiet field. Now it had led him here, at the gates of a criminal empire, with the life of an innocent woman bound to his. The calm in his features belied the storm of anticipation roiling within. He had faced threats in the past, though never within such a pervasive web of corruption. The difference here was personal, no one else would champion the cause of a lone rancher's daughter. If he faltered, she stood alone. He set his jaw. The faintest breath of wind disturbed the leaves overhead, carrying the promise of dawn. Their vantage in the oak grove seemed hidden enough for the moment, so he let his eyes close, though only partially surrendered to rest. Images of the farmland gliding by under moonlight, of bullet-riddled barns, and the looming silhouettes of black SUVs haunted the space behind his eyelids. He found an anchor in his own sense of purpose. As long as his heart beat, as long as he drew breath, he would not allow the innocent to be crushed by cruelty. By whatever means necessary, he intended to break the stranglehold that had left so many cowering. Night wore on, the hush around them punctuated by faint noises drifting from the nearby town, a distant bark of a dog, the roar of a late-night vehicle, perhaps a motorbike belonging to one of the enforcers patrolling the streets. Each sound reminded them that vigilance was paramount. At intervals, he roused himself, scanning the darkness, verifying that no headlights cut across the oak grove. The hours crept toward morning, the air cooling slightly. She dozed in shallow bouts, the tension never fully leaving her posture. When the faint grays of pre-dawn began to touch the eastern sky, he shifted, awakening fully. The time had come to take the next step, to gather the intelligence they needed and lay the groundwork for confrontation. Whatever alliances or opportunities waited in that town would need to be discovered carefully. Already, shapes of houses emerged in the far distance, cast in a ghostly outline against the horizon's growing light. They exchanged a single glance, the unspoken question clear: was there truly any path to victory against a fortress of corruption? Yet neither shied away. They slipped out from beneath the oak's shelter, packed their minimal belongings, and approached the hidden motorcycle. The day's plan, quiet infiltration, reconnaissance, would rely on stealth and cunning. Thus began the final stretch of their journey, one that would decide not only their fates but also the fate of all who had fallen under the boss's ruthless dominion. In the pale hush before sunrise, Chuck Norris guided the motorcycle onto a narrow lane that traced the edge of the oak grove. Each rotation of the wheels brought them closer to the heart of darkness, where a singular act of defiance would soon collide head-on with an empire steeped in menace. They rode forward with the conviction that no matter how fearsome the storms to come, their determination to stand against tyranny would endure. Dawn revealed the outer contours of a sleeping town, its rooftops and low buildings illuminated by the first pale rays spreading across the horizon. Chuck Norris guided the motorcycle at a measured pace down a deserted side street, the engine kept deliberately low so as not to rouse early risers. Beside him, the young woman glanced around with quiet apprehension, taking in the sight of cracked sidewalks and leaning telephone poles. Although the place seemed outwardly calm, each intersection or shuttered storefront could hide informants or armed lookouts. Neither traveler felt any illusion that the path ahead would remain this placid. They found a patch of shadow where an abandoned loading dock jutted from a boarded-up warehouse. Easing the motorcycle behind the structure, they dismounted, moving carefully among broken pallets and strands of windblown trash. With dawn brightening by the minute, they needed a vantage to observe the town's routines, who came and went, which vehicles made suspicious rounds, and where official authority intersected with the hidden reach of the mafia boss they intended to confront. The warehouse's rear entrance was locked, but a broken window above some crates allowed Chuck to hoist himself inside. He beckoned for her to follow, assisting her through the shattered frame with minimal noise. The space inside smelled of old chemicals and dust, illuminated faintly by slivers of early sunlight breaching the boarded windows. Rows of rusted shelving stood in random disarray, while the concrete floor bore oil stains and scattered debris. At one corner, a rickety metal staircase led to a small office loft overlooking the main floor, a vantage that might offer a clearer view outside. Chuck tested the steps with caution, mindful of potential collapse, but the structure held firm. The young woman followed, each footstep echoing in the cavernous emptiness. From the loft's window, they looked out onto a stretch of road leading toward the central district. Early morning traffic was sparse, a lone pickup rattling by, an old sedan rolling slowly with a squeaking fan belt, the occasional pedestrian scurrying along as though eager to finish errands before the heat of the day. The overall quiet formed a veneer of normalcy, though both knew it concealed an undercurrent of fear. At intervals, they glimpsed a police cruiser or a newer SUV prowling the streets, unremarkable in a typical town, but here it likely represented the intertwined presence of law enforcement and mafia oversight. They watched for an hour, shifting occasionally to relieve stiffness. In that time, they noted a pattern of two black SUVs circling the same blocks, pausing near certain intersections as if awaiting signals. Another vehicle, a dark unmarked sedan, parked across from what appeared to be a modest government building, possibly the local city hall or courthouse. Outwardly, these observations were ordinary, but the repeated routes and discrete vantage points suggested a network of watchers. Chuck recognized the hallmark of a territory under the boss's control: intimidation enforced by vehicles and roving men who preferred to remain inconspicuous until a target was identified. The young woman carefully pointed out a side street that led toward the older part of town, a district of narrow lanes, older masonry facades, and a small central square with a stone fountain. She recalled hearing that the boss maintained a personal estate on the outskirts, but that his day-to-day operations often ran through a building near that square, disguised as a legitimate business. She also mentioned a separate rumor of a private compound or mansion beyond the city limits, heavily guarded and removed from prying eyes. Either location might serve as the final stronghold. The question remained which place was more likely to house the boss himself. Chuck weighed both possibilities. Infiltrating the estate beyond city limits might require a larger-scale incursion, whereas slipping into the heart of the town's nerve center might expose them to immediate retaliation from the corrupted police force. For now, reconnaissance took priority. They needed more definite intelligence, the layout of guard rotations, a sense of how swiftly reinforcements arrived, and whether any local citizens could be trusted to give them accurate details. Yet the million-dollar bounty added an extra layer of risk. Even the most sympathetic resident might be tempted to betray them for a chance at that sum. They left the warehouse as the morning grew brighter. Vaulting back through the broken window, they retrieved the motorcycle, keeping to side alleys that snaked away from the main roads. A few blocks over, they discovered a dilapidated parking lot behind a shuttered hardware store. The fence around it was torn, and no sign of activity suggested regular use. They steered the bike behind a row of crates, camouflaging it with stray cardboard and debris. On foot, blending into the handful of pedestrians heading for work or errands, they could move with relative anonymity, assuming no one recognized them from the mafia's bulletins or prior rumors. They advanced through quieter streets, the young woman adjusting a borrowed baseball cap to partially obscure her features. Chuck walked with a subtle alertness, scanning doorways, rooftops, and vehicles for any sign of watchers. The typical rhythms of a small city morning unfolded around them: a bakery unlocking its doors, an old man sweeping a storefront stoop, a handful of children crossing the street with backpacks. Yet for every normal scene, an undercurrent of wariness prevailed. Residents spoke in hushed tones, avoided eye contact, and seldom lingered in open public spaces. This was the hallmark of a populace accustomed to living under a silent but ever-present threat. Near an old church, they paused to examine the narrow lane that led deeper into the historic district. Two men in plain clothes stood at the corner, posture rigid, eyes scrutinizing every passerby. Their stoic stance and almost military readiness suggested they were not casual loiterers. Chuck and his companion detoured around the block, avoiding that intersection. Circling behind the church grounds, they reached a vantage where part of the central square became visible. A fountain, chipped and stained with age, sat in the center. Around it, a cluster of official-looking buildings faced each other across an open plaza. One building bore an aged sign that might once have read Town Hall, though years of weathering had reduced the letters to ghostly outlines. On a nearby street, an unmarked sedan idled in front of a low structure with tinted windows. A man emerged from inside, leaning briefly to speak with the sedan's driver. The occupant offered no overt reaction, then the man turned and re-entered the building. Chuck observed that the driver kept glancing at side mirrors, scanning the environment. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet it illustrated the kind of quick coordination often favored by criminal groups: minimal contact in public, immediate concealment behind tinted glass. They needed a place to observe the square without standing out. The church itself might offer vantage if they could access a tower or upper window. Alternatively, a partially collapsed building across the plaza, ringed by scaffolding, suggested a second possibility. Chuck motioned for her to remain hidden while he carefully approached that scaffolding from the rear alley, stepping past piles of broken bricks and rotted boards. A sign indicated renovation had begun some time ago and then ceased abruptly, presumably under mafia pressure or an unprofitable contract. He found a gap in the fencing where the scaffolding met the alley. The wooden boards felt somewhat sturdy, though hammered in place haphazardly. Climbing gingerly, he ascended 2 floors until he reached a vantage inside what had once been a large window or archway. From that height, parts of the square lay directly in his field of view. The fountain gleamed in the sunlight, and a handful of pedestrians crossed from one side to the other. Most kept their heads down. Across the plaza stood the building from which the plainclothes man had emerged, a structure with tinted windows and a discreet side entrance. A sign or plaque near the main door was too small to read from this distance, but Chuck suspected it concealed an important nerve center of the local operation. An hour passed in tense observation. 2 more vehicles arrived, one a plain sedan, the other a battered truck whose driver wore the uniform of a local official, perhaps a city clerk. The driver disappeared into that same tinted window building with a sealed envelope in hand, reappeared 10 minutes later, and drove away looking unsettled. Another figure emerged, wearing a fine suit that seemed out of place in such a humble setting, and spoke briefly with a guard near the door before leaving in a black SUV. Chuck memorized the man's appearance: broad-shouldered, hair neatly combed, mid-40s, carrying himself with practiced confidence. Possibly a senior enforcer. He clung to the shadows of the scaffolding, measuring how heavily the place was guarded. 2 watchers at the entrance, likely armed, maintained a subtle but present lookout. The upper windows, tinted from the inside, allowed no glimpse of what lay within. Any infiltration attempt would meet immediate resistance unless approached with cunning. Chuck slid back down the scaffolding, careful to remain unseen, and returned to where the young woman waited in the alley. She listened intently as he relayed the details through minimal gestures and quiet words. That building probably contained vital records of criminal transactions, or perhaps it served as a front for more covert dealings. If the boss had left the city for a private estate, his top lieutenants would still use this location as a hub for day-to-day control. They considered the possibility of entering under cover of darkness. Yet forcibly breaching a mafia stronghold risked a large-scale firefight they were ill-equipped to handle. Subtlety might be their only chance: slip inside quietly, gather whatever intelligence possible about the boss's whereabouts, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The day wore on under a punishing sun. They retreated from the immediate vicinity of the square, weaving through side streets until they found a neglected courtyard behind a row of cramped apartments. Laundry lines sagged overhead, and stray cats meandered through trash. They sheltered in the shade of a stairwell, sharing the last dregs of water from their canteen. Hunger gnawed at them, but stepping into a restaurant or market was too risky. $1 million bounty could entice even the humblest store clerk to place a frantic call. Despite the exhaustion fraying at their nerves, they maintained vigilance. The echo of footsteps or the rumble of an engine passing near triggered instant caution. From their vantage, they noticed signs of deeper rot: local children scurrying about in a hush, eyes darting at every adult who crossed their path, older residents huddled in doorways whispering with the hush of the fearful. This was a community weighed down by the mafia's domination, where even daily routines carried the tension of suppressed panic. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the streets when they ventured back to retrieve the motorcycle. The same battered crates hid it from casual view. No sign indicated that anyone had discovered it. They carefully inspected the area for fresh footprints or tampering, none found. They decided, however, not to linger in the parking lot after dusk. A different hideout would be preferable. The city's outskirts might contain abandoned garages or half-finished housing developments where they could remain unseen through the night. They navigated a twisting route south of the main square, passing clusters of empty lots and half-built structures, the result of stalled projects likely connected to mafia extortion. Weeds sprouted through concrete foundations, and plastic tarps flapped in the breeze. Eventually, near the old industrial district, they came upon a partially completed warehouse ringed by a chain-link fence. The padlock on the gate sat broken, possibly from scavengers. Inside, steel girders rose around a vast open floor, with no walls finished. It was just enough to provide partial cover from prying eyes. They rolled the bike into a corner beneath a row of temporary scaffolding. The sun's final rays painted the metal beams in hues of gold and orange. Night would come quickly. The building's skeletal frame offered an expansive vantage of the sky above, an empty roof skeleton blocking direct line of sight but letting wind whistle through. He and the young woman found a spot shielded by stacked corrugated sheets, forming a makeshift enclosure. Though the location felt exposed, they had little choice. The alternative was to roam city streets after dark, easy prey for any patrol that recognized them. As they settled in, they assessed the plan for the coming night. Gathering intelligence from that tinted window building might require infiltration in the darkest hours, but the risk remained high. Another approach might be gleaning local rumors of the boss's personal habits, his rumored compound, the times he visited the city. The young woman recalled a name, an older rancher turned bar owner who once opposed the mafia's expansion. If that man was still alive, perhaps he carried resentment strong enough to aid them. The challenge lay in finding him without tipping off the boss's watchers. Night fell, the city's scattered lights forming a constellation of uneasy life. From their vantage, they could hear distant engines and see the faint glow of headlamps on a nearby highway. A pair of dogs barked somewhere to the west, then fell silent. They shared a small meal of canned beans, subdued by the knowledge that real danger was moments away if the wrong person stumbled upon their hideout. Chuck, sitting with his back against a metal column, quietly cleaned the Colt 1911 with a strip of cloth, verifying each detail again. The conversation turned to the possibility of confronting the boss at his rumored estate. The idea was simple: if the man who orchestrated terror could be neutralized, the entire network might fracture. She understood the personal risk. The man commanded a small army of enforcers, plus the corrupt police who would respond with overwhelming force. Still, running was no longer feasible. Each day the pursuit tightened, and she refused to live forever in flight. Chuck sensed the grim resolve that matched his own unyielding sense of honor. The stage was set for a reckoning, no matter how uneven the odds. They agreed to attempt an infiltration of the building near the square in the next day or two. Once they had a better feel for guard schedules. If direct infiltration proved impossible, they would pivot to the estate approach, perhaps staging an ambush or a stealth incursion. Uncertainty lingered: would the boss be there, or was he cunning enough to remain hidden in some undisclosed haven? And even if they managed to confront him, how would they handle the wave of retaliation certain to follow? She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the day he had intervened to save her, that desperate moment at the ranch when her world had collapsed. She had lost her home, and in its place she found a precarious alliance with a lone man who refused to bend to the same forces that had broken entire counties. At times, the strain of it threatened to overwhelm her. Yet in Chuck's composure, she found a steadiness she could cling to. He laid a hand on the cold steel floor, feeling the night air seep through the skeleton of the warehouse. The city around them held secrets, but dawn would bring new chances to unravel them. He would visit known meeting points, shadow the watchers, or even lure them into confrontation to glean vital information. The final confrontation was nearing. In the hush of that dark and incomplete structure, they could almost sense the path of fate converging. The moment that began with a nighttime rescue at a ranch had led them here, to the threshold of a ruthless empire. They fashioned a makeshift sleeping area using their meager supplies. One tarp, the last of their water, and the unspoken resolve that tomorrow they would step deeper into the labyrinth. The night drifted by in intervals of uneasy dozing and periodic jolts of alertness whenever a muffled sound echoed through the beams. Hours passed like that, tension coiled beneath every breath. At the first glimmer of dawn, Chuck rose, stretching stiff muscles. The city would soon stir, and with it came watchers, informants, and the daily routines that might hide clues to the mafia's operation. He helped the young woman stand, and together they packed up. Outside, the sky showed a faint blue along the horizon, silhouetting half-built walls and tangles of rebar. The day would be a trial of cunning and composure. The forces aligned against them showed no mercy, and the boss's web of influence had strangled dissent for years. They set out, leaving the motorcycle concealed in the same corner of the skeleton warehouse. On foot, they navigated a path through empty lots to the nearest cluster of inhabited streets. It was time to pick up the trail of the bar owner she had mentioned. If he still lived in this city, perhaps he could provide intel about the boss's estate or the best way inside the tinted window stronghold. The search entailed risk. Questions asked in the wrong ear could trigger an immediate alarm. Yet the alternative, remaining blind, was worse. As morning traffic trickled in, they skirted busy roads, hugging side alleys and seldom used footpaths. The city's pulse quickened around them. Shopkeepers rolled up metal shutters, bus drivers revved engines, and clusters of laborers trod the sidewalks in subdued conversation. Watchful eyes lingered at certain intersections, men in nondescript clothing, posture too rigid for casual bystanders. Now and then, a local policeman stood at a crosswalk, scanning the crowd without warmth. The environment felt thick with suspicion, as though any misstep could invite pursuit. They eventually reached a district known for older cantinas and bars, many with boarded windows and battered signs. Though it was early, some establishments catered to overnight workers or travelers seeking a pre-dawn drink. She led him to a side street where a large sign once read, "Figueroa's Bar," though the paint had peeled so extensively that only fragments of letters remained. A single dusty pickup truck sat out front, and the door hung ajar despite the hour. Peering through the doorway, Chuck glimpsed a dim interior with battered tables, one overhead fan rotating lazily. A single figure stood behind the bar, wiping glasses with an air of indifference. No other patrons seemed present. Was this the bar owner she had mentioned, or someone else entirely? They exchanged a look, wordlessly measuring the risk. If this individual was a collaborator, they would walk into a trap. If he was an old opponent of the mafia, he might still recall a shred of defiance that could aid them. They stepped inside, hearts pounding with readiness. The faint odor of stale beer and disinfectant hit them. The bartender, a stooped older man in a threadbare shirt, glanced up, eyebrows raised. His expression flickered from curiosity to guarded wariness. Chuck and the young woman approached the counter, scanning for concealed weapons or suspicious movement. The man set down his glass, regarding them with an unreadable gaze. Outside, the muted sounds of traffic underscored the precariousness of this meeting. They stood there in a silence thick enough to weigh on the breath. The bar's walls, decorated with old posters and a few dusty trophies, bore witness to a different era. The fan's rhythmic squeak punctuated every passing second. In a place where one wrong word could mean a call to the mafia enforcers, they faced a crucial decision: reveal their need for help, or feign passing interest. Chuck studied the bartender's eyes, searching for any hint of recognition or hidden malice. The bartender's tired posture and lined face suggested a man who had borne many disappointments. Very softly, the young woman broke their vow of near silence with a brief mention of the bar owner's name she had recalled. The older man stiffened, jaw tightening, indicating the name indeed meant something. Whether that something was hostility or empathy, neither Chuck nor the woman could yet discern. The next seconds would determine if they had found a necessary ally or if the tenuous progress they had made would unravel in a single moment of betrayal. Thus they stood in the shadows of a neglected bar, in a city teetering under the weight of corruption, poised at the brink of a plan that would either ignite the downfall of a criminal empire or condemn them both to swift retribution. Morning light filtered through the open doorway, illuminating motes of dust in the stagnant air, as if even the sun itself hesitated to intrude too far into this domain of hushed secrets. Everything hung in the balance, compressed into that silent confrontation, a test of trust against a backdrop of fear.